Hello and welcome to episode 29 of Chrontendo. This will cover most of March 1988, and as mentioned earlier, this is when the first wave of military strategy and simulation games hits Japanese consoles. In fact, we'll see two similar games released on the very same day. We'll also have a quick look at the rise and fall of Taito. By the way, those of you who have chronological list of Famicom releases might notice a couple missing games. Those two, Twinbee and the Tanikawa Koji game, are simply re-releases of earlier titles on a different format. We will always be skipping these since we covered the games when they first came out. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. The NES's ability to generate wave-like white noise sounds comes in handy here. Alright, so let's go ahead and begin by mopping up February with a couple undated non-Japanese games. First up is TNC Wood and Water Rage. A dirty sounding name to be sure, but this LGN title is actually a pretty harmless little game in the California Games / Skate or Die mode. There's two options here, skating or surfing. Now, those of you under the age of 25 might be a little baffled wondering what all this crap is. Well, young people, let me explain it to you. TNC, that's Town & Country Surf Designs. They were a surfboard manufacturer who also had a clothing line. In the mid-1980s, they released a series of shirts featuring designs by graphic artist Steve Nazar, which had all these crazy surfing cartoon characters. Thrilla Gorilla, Joe Cool, a caveman surfer, a guy with a witch doctor mask, and so on. These shirts were ubiquitous for a few years and enormously popular among young kids for a brief time before disappearing into obscurity. Well, last episode we saw a Ronald McDonald game, and now we have this. So yeah, the NES is definitely becoming a bit crasser all the time. So in the skateboarding segment, you navigate through a shockingly poorly maintained stretch of road, avoiding objects, holes in the road, and so on. Jumping over objects and doing simple skate tricks will get you points. Along the way you have to watch out for flying objects and remote control cars, that sort of thing. The controls are pretty simple. You can move in four directions and jump either by jumping off the skateboard or by grabbing and jumping with the board in the air as well. Perhaps the most irritating factor is while the game depicts objects in pseudo 3D using oblique perspective, the collision section is more 2D. Thus you can hit an object that you appear to actually be going behind. You have to literally be above the object in order to pass behind it. The levels aren't too long, and if you get to the finish, the level will restart, though in a slightly longer version. And there's really only one level. The object is simply to get as many points as you can. Now the game style seems very Western to me, but it appears that LGN farmed out the development to Atlas, who then, according to Game Developer Research Institute, may have subcontracted to Sanritsu. And this is apparently also the case with Gacha the Sport. Either way, this game feels like a soulless contract work. Now the second game here is surfing. This is where the rage kicks in. You have the option of playing Thrilla Gorilla or Cool Cat. While the skateboarding section isn't that bad, the surfing tends to raise gamers' ire. Much like the Epic's sports games, the primary challenge here is figuring out the rather temperamental controls and the sketchy gameplay mechanics. You move your character either to the top or the bottom of the wave, and pressing the button will allow you to perform a jump, but some sort of gravitational force is constantly pulling you towards the left side of the screen. You can generally resist for a little bit, but frequently you'll suddenly lose control and get sucked into the wave for some mysterious reason. The whole thing is sort of baffling and irritating and is best avoided. Actually, the entire game feels like a quickie cache and is probably avoided as well. On the other hand, if you actually like the TNC games, there's going to be a sequel which we'll have to cover at some point. Okay, so how about a game people actually like? Here's RC Pro-Am, a US and Europe only title from Nintendo, which came out sometime in February 1988. The exact date seems lost to the mist of time. This title was developed by Rare, it says so right on the title screen. The habit of hiding your contract developers seems to be a Japanese thing. Nintendo of America and most US video game publishers had no problem revealing who actually made the games. As you can see, this is a game about racing radio-controlled trucks. Hence RC Pro-Am racing, which leads to the question, Pro-Am? Are there actually professional RC car racers? could see them racing for money, but do people actually do it professionally? I suppose it's entirely possible, though in real life they're probably not equipped with missiles and bombs like the toys in this thing are. Which leads to an interesting point. This didn't actually start out as an RC car game. The Fall 87 issue of Nintendo Fun Club News had a preview which shows the title screen with cars without antennas, and the name Pro-Am Racing. So it seems the game was originally planned to be about actual car racing. Maybe the violence, the missiles and whatnot, prompted Nintendo to alter the game. Shooting missiles at radio-controlled cars is one thing, shooting at cars with actual people is another. So RC Pro-Am is simply put a racing game. You do a few laps on the track and try not to come out last. There are some very simple RPG-type elements added in, as is standard in racing games in 1988. You sort of level up your car permanently by picking up upgrades to tires, the accelerator, and so on. Though not to the extent of some of the other recent car games, such as Taito Grand Prix. Also, you see down underneath the map of the track there the letters NIN. Once you collect all the letters to form the word Nintendo, your car sort of powers up to be a better vehicle. Now, I'll confess I don't really like this game. I'm actually pretty terrible at it, but the game was quite popular in the US. Nintendo heavily promoted it. It was on the cover of the February-March Fun Club News, and people have pleasant memories of it to this day. So if you've never played it, I would definitely give it a try. March is here. Chrontendo's got March Madness. Well, we must be crazy for digging up some of these games, like Druid from Jellico, and great little animated intro from Jellico there, by the way. Alright, so we've got the FDS going here, and we'll actually see a pretty cool title screen. There you see a Druid and his Golem. An odd combination since Druids were Celtic priests and Golems were generally constructed by rabbis. Creating a Golem is supposed to require the ability to write in Hebrew, and it's not clear where a Druid would learn something like that. Such questions aside, we would say that Druid is a simple little top-down action-adventure game, and in retrospect it looks kinda like a lame Zelda clone, which might be why Jellico released it in Japan. As you can see, very Zelda-like. This involves you running around, destroying enemies, opening up chests, getting items, that sort of thing. But here's the thing, it's actually a port of a 1986 computer game from a somewhat respected British publisher called Firebird. It originally came out on various computer platforms. Let's take a quick look at some of these. Here, for example, is the ZX Spectrum version. It was released on the Spectrum, Commodore 64, Atari computers. Pretty ugly looking game, I suppose. Spectrum fans would find this brilliant. Everyone else, not so much. Eventually it made its way to Japan and received an MX2 port, courtesy of Dextersoft. The title screen shows a meaner looking clean-shaven Druid in contrast with a cute little wizard from the other versions. Dexter was the company which seems to have had some kind of connection to Jellico, having put out several Jellico games on the MSX. As you can see, this is one ugly game, and suffers from the typical standard awful scrolling effects of the MSX. So clearly the Famicom game here is the most aesthetically pleasing of all the versions. At the time of its initial release, it was invariably compared to Gauntlet, despite being a single-player game, as it involves running around dungeons and whatnot, shooting endless streams of ghosts and goblins. I guess this sort of makes sense. For you younger folks, be aware that Gauntlet was an enormously popular game in arcades in the mid-80s, and countless similar games were produced. So anyway, you roam around each level opening treasure chests, from which you can choose to pick up a weapons refill, or sometimes like a key or a spell. You can only pick out one item. One such spell is the Golem, who we saw a moment ago. This will generate a Golem to follow you around and take out enemies. Though he seems to always walk behind you, so he's really not that useful. I realize now this reminds me a lot of Aztec Adventure for the Master System, covered back in Chrontendo number 4. So the actual object of each level is simply to find the exit. This will generally require to pick up some one-time use keys to open various locked doors. There are supposedly 8 levels altogether, and every so often a boss will appear. The dungeons here seem a bit more gauntlet-y than the wide-open outdoor spaces we saw at the beginning of the game. Now there are some nice touches, like for example the spells have like an elemental property attached to them, and certain enemies will be more susceptible to different types of elemental attacks. You have to like fire for some enemies, lightning for the other. But overall the game is pretty simple and repetitive, nothing exciting ever really happens in the game, and it seems very much like a pre-Zelda adventure game. There's really not that much in the way of exploration or secrets or anything like that, so all in all I'd still consider it to be a pretty minor release from Jaleco. Oh boy, another inscrutable FDS game from SoftPro. They started off making MSX games, and they moved on to such weird Famicom titles as Breeder, the robot breeding and fighting game, and Hikari no Pulsar, a bizarre space simulation game. Continuing in this fine tradition, we have 19, or Neunzehn. It's usually listed as 19-Neunzehn. Not sure if it's 19 Neunzehn or just Neunzehn. I mentioned the wave of military simulation type games headed for the Famicom, and Neunzehn kicks things off today. Box art shows various Greco-Roman style busts, so perhaps some sort of ancient warfare theme. This leads to the question, why is the game called Neunzehn? 19 what exactly? However, SoftPro is a bit ahead of its time by giving this a German or German-sounding title, sort of like Der Langrissier. The box describes the game as a real simulation game. Yes, it actually does say simulation. And this appears to be a very simple, turn-based military strategy game. Well, calling it strategy might be giving it a bit more complexity than it deserves. You choose one of 4 armies, you have a base, mine's the green one up in the upper right-hand corner there. You can manufacture more units. Every turn you move your units. If you reach an enemy unit, a battle occurs. Other than moving around and fighting battles, it isn't really clear to me what there is to do in 19. I don't see any resources to collect or towns to capture. Perhaps I didn't really get far enough into the game, but you can't really blame me because the battle segments are so painful. Nowadays we think of these things as being either real-time or turn-based. Here the battles are sort of simultaneous turn-based, meaning the action freezes and you plan your moves. Your units can move, attack, throw projectiles, or wait. But after you're done, both sides move at the same time. This makes it difficult to plan out your moves since you have no idea where the enemy is going to move. Since you don't know where the computer is going to move to, it's difficult to actually position your units to collide with them. A lot of times you end up just walking right past enemy units. The majority of the battle scenes consist of you and the enemy simply chasing each other around. You can see this going on right here. Thus these battles are pretty long and drawn out, involve a lot of sort of randomly chasing around. Now, I could be completely misunderstanding the point of this game, but I suspect this is just a very primitive, poorly thought out military tactics game. Here's an oddity from Pony Canyon, Lucasfilm Games. Yep, it's a Famicom version of Ballblazer. Not something I would expect to see released on this console, but it came out for every other system at the time, so why not? One intriguing addition is this intro, which shows you how the game works from a traditional 3/4 view perspective. For those not familiar with Ballblazer, it was in fact the first game released from the brand new Lucasfilm Games studio. The first version was for the Atari 800 computer in 1984. It's a pretty fast-paced 3D game. It's sort of like soccer, only it's played by these land speeder-like ships. The object is to grab the ball and shoot it through a set of moving goalposts. The screen shows you the viewpoints of both ships at all times. As you can see here, it is a reasonably fast-paced game. Now here's the Famicom version again. Obviously doesn't look quite as smooth as the original. Nice straight lines from the Atari computer version have been replaced with these blocky, jaggy looking things. For those of you who've never played Ballblazer, it might look kind of like pure chaos. What exactly is going on? Well, definitely does take some getting used to. One thing about the controls, your ship automatically turns to face the ball. You use the D-pad to slide to left or right or forward and backward, but rotating to change directions just sort of happens. Thus, if the ball is moving around a lot, you'll find yourself in sort of flipping directions kind of confusingly. Ballblazer certainly has its fans, but it seems more of a demo or a warm-up for Lucasfilm Games. Not exactly Monkey Island, that's for sure. One problem I kept encountering was when both ships would tend to sort of end at a 90-degree angle towards each other, with the ball in the middle, trying to push each other in different directions. Eventually you can just sort of end up in a corner in a stalemate. But I'm not really a fan of the game, so there's probably some sort of way around this. Overall, it seems like a pretty minor release. Oddly, Activision's name is featured prominently on the cover. They released a few ports, such as the Commodore 64 version, and I assume Pony Canyon had to license the game from them. Before we get into our next game, Arkanoid II from Taito, I thought we'd briefly take a look at the history of this company, being one of the longest lasting video game makers, though one that has seen a slow decline in their fortunes after at one time being about the biggest video game company in existence. Just like Sega, Taito was founded by a non-native of Japan, in this case Michael Kogan, a Russian Jew who fled Russia to China, then moved to Japan in 1939. This is, I believe, a picture of the young Mr. Kogan. In 1953, he founded the Taito Trading Company in the Minato division of Tokyo. This particular area is heavily populated with businesses and manufacturing. Taito was originally set up to sell vodka in Japan. By 1956, Taito had branched out to sales of amusement equipment and jukeboxes, and in the 1960s they were the sole source in Japan of the Seaberg jukeboxes from the US. Then in 1971, Taito purchased another company called Japan Vending Machines and got deeper into the amusement machine business. Finally, in 1972, Taito changed its name to Taito Corporation and manufactured its first video arcade games in 1973, supposedly the first in Japan. The first game was either Elapong or Soccer, depending on the source. Either way, they're both clones of Atari's Pong, which came out the year prior. Most of Taito's early games were designed by a young man named Tomohiro Nishikado, who is really the father of Japanese video game design, and perhaps the single person most responsible for Taito's initial success. In 1975, Taito's games began making their way overseas when Western Gun was redesigned by Nutting, the same company that released Space Wars, the first arcade video game, and then distributed in the US by Midway, under the name Gunfight. Through Midway, Taito suddenly had a distributor of games in the US. Taito's early games were all pretty typical of the era, simple black and white affairs, often with sports or military themes. At this point, they were the veterans in the relatively young video game field. By 1978, they'd been making games for 5 years. Of course, that was the year that everything changed. In 1978, arcade games went from being a reasonably popular curiosity to a nationwide mania, all due to one game, Space Invaders. Designed by Tomohiro Nishikado, Space Invaders was the medium's breakthrough hit. So popular in Japan that it supposedly caused a 100-yen coin shortage and resulted in video arcades spreading up everywhere in Japan and the United States. Even though Taito's immediate follow-up, Lunar Rescue, was not as successful, Space Invaders allowed Taito to expand and even set up operations in the US. For the time being, they were at the top of the pile. Over the next few years, Taito continued to crank out the hits. Kicks was a highly original puzzle game and one that's been copied countless times over. In the early 1980s, Taito games were all over the arcades, including such as its Zookeeper from 1982 and Elevator Action from 1983, as well as various games we've seen in their Famicom incarnations, Legend of Kaga, Arkanoid, Bubble Bobble, as well as more obscure games like the proto-fighting game Typhoon Gal, early beat-em-ups like Knuckle Joe, shooters such as Tiger Heli, or in 1986 the ultra-widescreen arcade shooter Darius. The Darius series, sort of Taito's answer to Gradius, featured a special custom cabinet with a wide monitor and a weird underwater theme. In the mid-1980s, Taito continued to make successful games such as the hack-and-slash Rastan, Double Dragon, and the exciting car chase game Chase HQ, so they were still reasonably successful at this point. But at the same time, the Nintendo Entertainment System was overshadowing arcade gaming. Taito, for whatever reason, never fully got on the console bandwagon. They ported many of their arcade hits, but they never really had a breakthrough hit for the consoles. Of course, they did release some fine original titles, but they are often a bit underlooked. Little Samson for the NES is a little-known late-period game for the system. Ballblazer is perhaps their most beloved original NES title, and it was a decent-sized hit, but Taito, for whatever reason, never really developed into a franchise. Legend of the Black Manta, released by Taito in the US, also had a bit of following. In the 16-bit era, they did branch out a bit, even trying their hand at RPGs, like with the Lufia series for the Super Nintendo. Another series that never quite took off, but did have games coming out until the GBA era. Darius Force was one of a few console-exclusive games in the Darius series, but doesn't really stack up with the best of the Super Nintendo shooters. For the most part, Taito stuck with what it knew best in the 1990s, making arcade games. After the success of Bubble Bobble, they came to sort of specialize in cute arcade platformers like New Zealand Story and Parasol Stars. Both were great games and had some fine console ports, and of course they continued to milk the Bubble Bobble games the best they could, releasing all sorts of sequels and spin-off games pretty much up to the very current day. A number of interesting Taito games were being released in arcades. For example, the oddball, animal rights-themed beat-em-up Growl, which is well remembered for its general insanity. Even weirder was Puli Rula, a genuinely surreal beat-em-up that remains one of Taito's most underappreciated arcade games. Taito had released some shoot-em-ups back in the 1980s and continued to do so in the next decade, but while the Darius games and the Rayforce games were pretty decent, Taito found themselves eventually sort of being overshadowed by other companies in this particular area. The same is true with fighting games. Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Fatal Fury, Tekken, Virtua Fighter. There were so many popular fighting games at the time, but Taito missed out on that particular money train as well. Speaking of money trains, what probably did keep Taito going through the lean years was this one, Densha de Go, a train simulation game. A huge hit in Japan, Taito pumped out tons of games in the series before finally shutting it down in 1997. Still, the 90s were really not that kind to Taito, with their US offices being closed in 1995, their attempt to release a CD-ROM console about that time also failing. Eventually, Taito was purchased outright by Square Enix in 2006. Still, today's Taito still manages to put out a lot of product. In Japan, they make fancy arcade games, as well as a lot of non-video game related product like redemption games, karaoke, and whatnot. Their profile has been raised quite a bit recently due to the success with such games as Space Invaders Extreme and, in Japan, the Cooking Mama series. Though quite frankly at this point, Taito seems to be mostly releasing new variations on its classic games like Arkanoid, Bubble Bobble, and whatnot, often for portable platforms, cell phones, WiiWare, and the ilk. Will they ever really be a major player again? It's hard to say. Well, for the moment, let's just go ahead and go back to 1988. Last time we saw the bizarre and abysmal Replicart from Taito. Now we have Arkanoid II. That's quite a step up. Note there's a few different modes here, including an edit mode. Now, the game starts in a rather creative fashion, with you replaying the final battle from the first game, sort of like Symphony of the Night. You relive the destruction of Do, Arkanoid's main boss, and then a little text scroll appears explaining that Do reappears at some point in the future and now you've got to defeat him again, though it doesn't really give much explanation for this. Now, of course, Do must be one of the most unfortunately named video game bosses ever, but remember that Arkanoid came out well before The Simpsons did, so you really can't blame Taito for this. But still, it might actually kind of remind you of Play-Doh, I suppose, if not The Simpsons. Yeah, there's the whole plot explained right there. One sort of odd thing about Arkanoid 2, as we'll see in a moment, there's actually a second title screen coming up. So anyway, after all the introductory hoo-ha, you're back to level after level of destroying bricks. This introduces silver blocks that are destructible, but will actually reappear after a little while. Now, as you might recall, Arkanoid 2 originally came out in arcades in 1987. The Arkanoid games were one of Taito's mid-80s arcade hits, along with, of course, Bubble Bobble. For some reason, they didn't really follow up with the sequel until years later. The Famicom version is pretty faithful to the arcade original, aside from a reduction in the number of colors. Now, the main novelty introduced in Arkanoid 2 was that after beating a level, you can exit to the left or the right, and this will take you to different levels. For example, in level 1, you can go left or right, like either levels 2 or 3. So you can sort of choose your own path throughout the game, which you'll have to play only half of the 64 levels. And as before, various power-ups can be bought, the ever-helpful laser, for example, as well as like a power-up that will make your ship wider, one that'll let you exit the level before you've blown up all the blocks, extra lives, and so on. And once again, this is compatible with a special Arkanoid rotary controller for the Famicom. As before, this is really the only way to play the game. Using the D-pad is not recommended. Here's the level editor mentioned earlier. So all in all, Arkanoid's a pretty high quality port from Taito, probably the best since Bubble Bobble. As I've noted in the past, Taito definitely seems sort of lagging when it comes to creating great original games for the system. Hey, it's more crap from Pack-In Video. They are sort of turning out to be the Japanese LJN. As you might recall, they were originally in the film distribution business, so they had all kinds of ties to film studios. Hence we get games like Predator. The first game we saw from them was Rambo, and that was the game where Rambo fights giant spiders. Predator is sort of like that. Well, so far this doesn't seem that bad. I assume you remember Predator, right? The 1987 movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Carl Weathers, Jesse Ventura, and almost featuring Jean-Claude Van Damme. Alien kills humans, most dangerous game style, but messes with the wrong guy, in this case, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So anyway, these nice little introductory illustrations here set up the plot from the movie. From time to time, another non-animated cutscene will appear and move the story forward. Probably a good thing because the game itself has pretty much no connection to the movie whatsoever. You can play a few levels of this and have no idea you were playing a game based on Predator. Now one interesting thing is take a look at the covers of the box art. This is one of those rare instances where they got a really awful box art in Japan, but I guess a semi-decent one in the United States, so this is one case where we actually lucked out in that department. Well, the obvious concerns here arise. Shouldn't you be wearing some sort of like camouflage or military green outfit as opposed to like a pink leotard? And as you find out quite quickly, most enemies are too small for you to hit, and when you crouch, you can't punch. So as a result, you do sort of have to mostly jump over enemies. This does actually look quite a bit like Rambo, doesn't it? Anyway, the levels are pretty straightforward, side-scrolling deals. You can sometimes go up or down as well, but it's nowhere near as confusing and non-linear as Rambo. The levels all seem to end in a door. And there's a bit of jumping involved, and it'll take a while to get used to the slippery surfaces that seem to be covering everything. Now as the game progresses, you'll start to encounter more irritations. Here, for example, you climb this little hill and somehow you sort of fall right through. Yeah, there are many parts where you can walk right through walls and fall to your doom. I mean, it's not really easy to see exactly which parts are solid and which parts are not. Thus, you have to be really careful where you land when you jump. Like right here, for example, I'll just pick up that life refill, and... whoa! I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. How can I fall through the ground just because there's a little hill? Well, eventually you will pick up a gun. Here I've got the laser, but be careful. The game loves taking stuff away from you. That little hand icon there will switch your weapon back to the bare fist, so very cautiously slip beneath it. Now at this point you're thinking, well, you've got some weapons, so things will improve a bit. I can actually shoot enemies for a change. However, as soon as you start the next level, no laser. Yep, that's right, your weapons will actually disappear each new level. And to add insult to injury, the game gives you these absolutely worthless grenades. Almost impossible to hit anything with these, and they have absolutely no blast radius whatsoever. And something else you might encounter in this game is you will be attacked by killer butterflies, just like the Rambo game. Now, at the end of this level, you'll actually encounter the Predator himself, and engage in a very sort of stupid little battle where he jumps around and does cannonballs in midair. Okay, now this is pretty lame, but believe it or not, it actually does get worse. After every so many levels, you'll have a level called Big Mode. Yep, that's right, Big Mode. Everything in this game gets bigger and uglier in these modes. These are these forced scrolling sections where you need to shoot or avoid these bubbles. At the end you'll face the Predator again, who attacks you by sending a group of small Predator heads at you. Seriously. And then after you've killed him, you go back to the jungle. Altogether there's about 30 stages. If you think, hey, the Predator is kind of hard to see there, he's not actually blinking out due to like problems with the sprite flicker. He's actually invisible most of the time. So this is a pretty terrible game. The developer Klon had been linked to this game. Their name was also on Replicart from last episode, so Klon looks like someone to definitely avoid. Oh, no, not another Nazoler Land game from Sunsoft. This is of course the series of magazine video games, each containing a handful of minigames. At least they're putting some effort into their menu screens. These little scrolls unfurl whenever you make a selection. But beyond this, what we have here is the standard array of little games. They're sort of a quiz game / board game. Getting the questions right will allow you to move your car around the track. And why do Japanese games have so many girls in bunny suits? Is that like a real thing in Japan, or just based on some weird misconception about American society? Another weird little platform game with this girl again. I recall seeing her in one of the earlier games in the series. I do like the music here. And let's not forget the bingo number generator. Not sure why there needs to be so many of these things for the Famicom. Even if bingo is a popular game to play in the home, I mean, it's like, hey, let's play bingo. Sure, I'll get out my video game console. I don't know why that guy jumps around so crazy whenever you get a bingo number. Oh yeah, and let's not forget the last thing here, the mailbag. Well, at least this is the final game in the series, and the next Sunsoft game released in Japan was Blaster Master. So there you go, we're going to see some improvements. Alright, so we've got a kid wearing a cowboy hat and a lei, holding an oversized shotgun? Cool. Well, actually really it's just a fishing pole. Tsurikichi Senpai, Blue Marlin Hen from Victor Interactive, a game based on a manga and anime. Yeah, the original manga was by Takao Yaguchi, which came out in the early 1970s, and then an animated TV series hit the airwaves in the early 80s. I think it was off the air by the time this game came out. Well, you start by entering your name, but you don't actually name the character, you name the boat. So as you may have gathered, Tsurikichi Sampei, Fisherman Sampei, is about fishing. This is the second Famicom fishing game we've seen, the Black Bass being the other one. And so you head out, I guess it's a big deal since they saw fireworks as your ship leaves. Then you decide where you want to fish. I assume that a fish icon appears in the square. Whenever that happens, that means it's a good place to stop. Ah, there's one now. And then the fishing action begins. So you've got to choose your bait, I believe. Once you've got the correct setup for the kind of fish in that area, you wait a bit. Like most fishing games, this isn't really thrilling stuff. Well, as it turns out, this wasn't the only Fisherman Sampei game to be released. Well, first of all, there was an MSX version of this same game. I'm not really sure which came out first, but next year there was an MSX-only sequel, which is actually a pretty nice looking game. I like the colors on this one, though it does seem to actually resemble the Black Bass quite a bit. It goes for a side view where you can actually see the sea life crawling around underneath the ocean. And then, a few years down the road, another Tsurikichi Senpai game was released by Bandai for the PlayStation. This was in the Simple Character 2000 series, which also had a bunch of Gundam games, a Kamen Rider game, and even a high school Gumi game. It's a pretty basic fishing game, but look at that, there's an easily understandable mechanic for catching your fish, something that is absent from the Famicom game. You need to wear the fish down without breaking your line. Oh hell yeah! I caught a fish. Something I couldn't do in the Famicom game because I couldn't really figure out the control scheme. I think you're supposed to sort of get the two arrows at the top there over on one side or get them far apart or something. Sadly, nothing I really did on the controller seemed to have any recognizable effect on that gauge. So I guess this game is going to have to remain a bit of a mystery. No loss, I'm sure. So, just about 2 weeks after 19, we have our second military tactics game, Napoleon Senki, which is often referred to as Battles of Napoleon, though nowadays I suppose it will be translated as Record of the Napoleonic Wars, if similar game titles are any indication. So we've got the Marseillaise playing over the title screen. By the way, the Marseillaise was actually banned by Napoleon, so perhaps it's not the most appropriate piece of music to have associated with this game. Napoleon Senki was published by Irem, who we last saw with Guardian Gaiden, aka the Guardian Legend, That game, of course, was from Compile, but this one is sadly by Lenar, the same folks behind Deadly Towers, which was notable for being called the worst NES game ever by Sean Baby, and also Bird Week, that weird game where you controlled a mother bird looking for food for her chicks. By most standards, this is a pretty typical military simulation game, perhaps a bit more interesting than 19. You choose from a few different play options, and then you'll sort of follow in a path of Napoleon's career, beginning with this Italian scenario. Presumably you are battling the Austrians here. Now, there are two types of soldiers on the battlefield. The ones with the brown hats and white pants are the enemies, and the other guys, the ones with the white hats, are actually potential allies. You can get them to join you. Obviously, you'll want to grab them in order to enlarge your own army. That's you with the blue hats and white pants there. Now, we probably don't really want to call this a real-time strategy game per se. It's not exactly Age of Empires, but I suppose it could be considered to be a very simple real-time tactics game. Both you and the enemy troops are moving at all times. You control the direction your troops are moving by placing the cursor above them. Then they'll start moving in the direction the cursor indicates. A rather odd system to be sure. You need to be mindful of where your guys are going, otherwise they might end up off the edge of the map or something if you don't really pay attention. Here I'm going to encounter some neutral troops and they will join my army. That's what's occurring right here. Now, when you encounter an actual enemy, you will then have to fight a battle. There are the enemy brown soldiers wandering around right there. And here we go. So it'll start by showing you the details of the forces involved, infantry, cavalry, and so on. This actually doesn't really look good for my team. And it gives you two battle options. The manual option will allow you to play sort of like a real-time battle sequence. First, you just sort of choose your formation, and then both sides line up, and it controls much like it does on the main map. You have all your forces sort of arrayed, kind of gives like a wide view of the overall battlefield there. You have your cannons, which can blow big holes in the enemy's armies, and this all involves quite a bit of micromanaging, because there's like a lot of troops moving around at all times. One way you can actually win is simply by killing the enemy's general. That'll sort of win you automatically. And I will say one thing is that Napoleon Senki actually does sort of give you a decent sized army, so it's not like where you're, 19 when you have like 8 units. You actually sort of feel like you're controlling like vast military forces here. Now, if all this is not your thing, you can choose the other battle option, which is like an automated battle, presumably utilizing like random dice rolls or something like that. If you do that, basically the battle will just sort of play out automatically, and you'll see the results in just a few seconds. Well, Napoleon Senki seems like a reasonably well put together game, even though it's, crude by today's standards. One bit of possible confusion: the Wikipedia entry for Napoleon Senki seems to confuse it with another game called L'Empereur, implying that these are actually two names of the same game. In fact, Koei's L'Empereur is a more sophisticated game based on the same subject matter, but they are definitely different games. Now we have our big military strategy game, Nobunaga no Yabou, or Nobunaga's Ambition, from Koei. This is the first game we've seen from Koei, and thus their first console game, though they have been making games for computers for a few years. Now right away we get some menus here ask you for a number of players, difficulty, and of course which daimyo you want to play. Some are a lot better than others, that's for sure. Let's go with the man himself, Oda Nobunaga. Technically you are choosing the stats for your territory. The stats for your feudal lord, or daimyo, are chosen randomly, though you can keep generating new random stats if you don't like the results. Now at this point you may be asking, hey, just who is this Oda Nobunaga guy? Well, let's take a super quick look at the history of medieval Japan. At the turn of the first millennium, Japan had been ruled for some time by an emperor and the emperor's court. All this changed in the 12th century when a civil war broke out between the two powerful clans, the Genji and the Taira. The Genpei War ended with the head of the Genji clan, Minamoto Yoritomo, defeating his rivals and establishing himself as the de facto ruler of Japan. Yoritomo was the first shogun, sort of a military dictator. The shoguns held onto their power for a couple hundred years, successfully defending Japan from its first overseas invasion by the Mongols in the 13th century. After another civil war and the rise of powerful feudal lords known as the daimyo, the shogunate had pretty much collapsed. This time period is known as the Sengoku era, or Warring States period. Japan lacked any sort of real central leadership. Oda Nobunaga was one such lord. Through a series of conquests and military alliances, he managed to control a pretty big chunk of the country. He was betrayed by one of his own generals in 1582, but he got the ball rolling. Finally, another daimyo, Tokugawa Ieyasu, succeeded in completely reunifying Japan and set himself up as shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate, or the Edo period of Japan, lasted until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Prior to the Famicom version, Nobunaga's ambition was released for Japanese computers in 1986, though some sources say 1983, which seems unlikely. The Famicom version seems to be pretty faithful to the computer version, and the US release seems to be pretty faithful to the original Japanese game. So here's the main map screen. This is a turn-based game, so we'll give you a lowdown of sort of what the other daimyo are doing. Generally, they will immediately start by invading some other territory. There will always be little animations for various events, be it plagues, typhoons, or battles occurring between the miscellaneous fiefs. This screen also gives you the going rates for various things you can buy and sell. The object of the game is to, of course, take over the entire map of Japan. One guy's already been killed, as we can see here. Now let's go to the screen where you actually issue your commands. As mentioned, this is a strategy game, not a strict military tactics game. You can make pacts, improve your cities, raise taxes, sell rice, all sorts of stuff. You can only perform one action per turn, more or less. What I'm doing here is I'm actually going to use the grow, which will increase my city's output. Whenever you do something like this, you have to decide how much money you actually want to spend towards making improvements. This will cause my output to go up, but be careful because growing your cities too quickly or raising taxes, these kind of things will cause your morale to drop, and in theory this could start a riot. Another fun thing to do is to hire ninjas to assassinate other daimyos. This is the most awesome animation in the game right here. He not only stabs the guy in the groin, but sort of wiggles the sword around. If you are successful in your assassination, you can then bid on the fief. This is risky because losing a bid will mean someone else will take control of the fief, basically after you've footed the bill for the ninjas. I kind of bid low on this one and got lucky and ended up taking control of Fief 13. Also, ninjas frequently fail in their missions to assassinate, so it's really sort of a shot in the dark. Each fief has its own sort of separate stats and money. You get money by selling extra rice, but one annoying thing, you can only buy and sell stuff if the merchant is in your area that turn. If you're low on cash and need it for troops or whatever, you'll have to wait for the merchant to swing by, and this can cause serious problems. Here I just sold a bunch of rice. Other things you'll be doing with the money is buying better arms for your men, hiring soldiers, that sort of thing. Now at some point, either you'll invade someone else's fief or someone will attack you. Then you'll enter into the battle section of the game. Now what I'm doing here, by the way, is training my men to increase their skill. This is actually very important. Nice thing about training is it doesn't require any money. So as I was mentioning, the battles here are 100% turn-based. Basically, you move all your units, and then the enemy will move his. You get to choose wherever you want to place your units. If the daimyo is killed, then it's game over. The battles seem to be determined by luck as well as stats, such as your army's training and the actual terrain that they're on. You can place troops on the hills, but not on the mountains. It seems that defense tends to do a little better than offense. It's the best sort of wait until enemies attack you. Now obviously, Nobunaga's Ambition is a pretty impressive game, and for Nintendo owners in the US, one of the first opportunities to sort of play something very much like a PC game on a console. Strategy games have been around on a long time on computers, but you wouldn't really think the genre would work on the Nintendo Entertainment System, but yet here it is. This goes to show that Koei had quite a bit of ambition themselves to have set up a US branch in 1988, and work on getting a game like this translated and out in the US by 1989. The game was of course a huge hit, and led to zillions of sequels, so this is actually a pretty impressive debut from Koei. I have a bit of criticism with this title screen here. The red splash at the bottom, along with the name Fighting Golf, makes it appear that someone just got their skull smashed in by the guy with the golf club. Wouldn't green have been a better color? That is supposed to be grass, right? Now, is it my imagination, or has it been a while since we've seen a game from SNK? I think the last one published by them was Athena, which was almost a year ago. So anyway, Fighting Golf is a golf game, one that lets you choose from a few different characters, including someone named Big Jumbo, obviously inspired by Jumbo Ozaki, who got his own official golf game last episode. Now, this was also released in the US, but there are a few differences between the versions. First of all, note this is a home version of a pretty recent contemporary arcade game, one known in the West as Lee Trevino's Fighting Golf. The arcade game came out in 1988, so this was another case of an arcade and a home version coming out at about the same time. Were you to compare these two versions of the game, you'd see they're actually pretty similar. Obviously, the arcade version has crisper colors and sound, but it's a pretty faithful reproduction. Now, as you might gather, this officially features the name and likeness of Lee Trevino. He was a very successful golfer in the 1970s, and was also notable for being perhaps the first famous Mexican-American golfer. Now, for the NES version, the game was released under the name Lee Trevino's Fighting Golf, and Trevino is one of the playable characters, listed there as Super Mex. And no, that's not some weird bit of Japanese craziness. Super Mex is Trevino's actual real-life nickname. If Miracle Chizuki is based on any real golfer, I have no idea who. The game works a lot like any other golf game, the main innovation being that the different golfers have different strengths and weaknesses. Eri, or Amy, for example, has a slower moving power meter, so it's easier to hit the ball exactly at the right time, right when it's below the arrow. Other than that, you have pretty much the same stuff as every other golf game we've seen. There's a Japan and US course. The Japan course seems to be a bit harder of the two. There's all these quite crazy water traps and whatnot. But this thing is like, maybe the 7th golf game we've seen for the Famicom? Plus 2 for the Master System? And most of these games are almost identical to each other. It's just a small variation on the same formula, but the formula is really getting tired. It's clear that there's some sort of mania for golf games in Japan, but I wish that the next game we'd see would maybe switch up the formula just a little bit. Okay folks, once again it's that time, and by that time I mean time for an off-the-wall game based on some obscure Japanese TV show. In this case it's Omoikkiri Tanteidan Haado Gumi. This was the 1987 entry in the long-running series called the Toei Fushigi Comedy Series. It concerns a group of school kids and a mysterious criminal who wears this creepy gold V for Vendetta-like mask. This guy's actually pretty frightening looking. I'm gonna put this into what I'd call the Paris-Dakar Rally School of Game Design. Much like that horrible little game, there are a couple completely extraneous mini-games tacked on to the beginning. You start off with a simple memory game involving cards with pictures of the show's various characters on them. Thrilling stuff. After that, you move on to a pretty pointless Kaboom-like game in which you catch roses thrown by the villain. I believe he gets around in a hot air balloon, that's what he's hanging off of here. So once you've got all that done, you move on to the title screen again, and then the real game begins. So what's the real game? Well, it's a side view adventure game. If I were to make a comparison, I'd say it feels like Goonies 2 meets Kemco's Superman, though it's clearly better looking than Superman. I think you're trying to find some sort of treasure that was stolen by Mr. Gold Mask. You shoot bad guys on the main street level, enter buildings, talk to NPCs. You have some basic inventory items at the top right there, including a slingshot, much like Goonies 2. I guess this sort of game design was actually pretty common at the time, more so in Japan than in the US. I suppose, this game actually looks halfway decent. We've certainly seen much worse looking games on Chrontendo, that's for sure. Who knows, this could actually be an undiscovered gem, but I somehow very much doubt it. Well, now that we've got this episode's Bandai game out of the way, we'll move on to the last couple of games this episode. Alright, we have another one here from Taito, Wardner no Mori, once again an FDS game. The decision to put this game on the FDS I feel was the wrong one. We'll discuss that in just a moment. There's a little animated intro here, and ugly. So ugly. This thing is really putrid looking. What were they thinking? A real shame, considering the port was actually a pretty nice looking arcade game. Let's compare this to the original intro. Whenever a robed and hooded gentleman asks you to join him on a quote-unquote fantasia, don't do it. For some reason, he turns your girlfriend into a crystal ball. Anyway, this is the original arcade version. We saw this game in Chrontendo in 1987 Arcade Roundup. A decent little Ghosts and Goblins style platformer developed by Toplin and manufactured by Taito. In the US, it was called Pyros for some reason. Maybe because you shoot fireballs. It's got an additional background layer, as you can see. Nice looking game. Too bad the Famicom port turned out so crude and primitive looking. Now some minor changes have been made. The arcade game is one of the one-hit kill variety, and here you have a life bar. Still, the game is not that easy. Part of it has to do with the old school clunky jumping and physics. You have a certain amount of control over your jump, but it still handles far more awkwardly than Super Mario Bros. Or Contra. The weird jumping leads to some unpleasant moments, like here for example. In order to cross this fire pit, you sort of need to jump from vine to vine. You'll need to be at the very bottom end of the vine when you make your jump, simply because you jump so high up in the air. Now once you figure it out, it's still not that hard, but the first time you play it, you're going to land in the fire pit, and I ended up missing a jump anyway. At the Navy level, there's a little shop where you can buy sort of like a weapons upgrade, plus, more importantly, health refills. This is the only way to refill your health in the game. Now, this was not the only port of Wardner. In 1990, it was released for the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, but not by Taito themselves. This version is more faithful to the original in both graphics and gameplay, but still looks pretty ugly and doesn't really handle that well, so I guess Wardner never really got like a definitive home version. Which is a bit of a shame, because like I said, it actually seems like a pretty decent arcade game. Anyway, going back to the Famicom, the difficulty wraps up a bit on the second level. You need to avoid all sorts of irritating, spiky death traps. This isn't exactly Ninja Gaiden tough, but it can be frustrating. It's quite a bit harder than Castlevania, for example. Some of the jumps require super precise timing to avoid taking a hit, like there when you sort of have to jump through those spiky crusher things. These things actually take quite a bit of practice to avoid taking some damage when jumping on these things. Add in some fast-moving blades coming at your head, often at the same time as flying enemies, and this level does get a bit hairy. At the end of each level there's a boss of sorts. It's a grey dragon here. After seeing the bosses in various Konami games or Mega Man, this guy seems pretty disappointing. Still a bit of a pain since your fireballs have pretty much no range, so you have to get up like really close to hit him. Oh, by the way, it turns out the princess actually was a monster, so you have to blast her as well. I found myself pretty disappointed with the home release of Wardner, since I really felt the game had potential. If Taito had maybe tightened up the controls a bit, added some extra stuff, this could have been a really cool game. But even aside from the controls, putting the game on the disc system was kind of a bad idea. The discs were just too small, for one. Also, you couldn't add in extra RAM chips like you could on cartridges. Comparing Wardner to Konami's port of Contra just shows just how far short Taito fell here. Contra proved that with some work, you could take a cutting-edge arcade game and turn it into a great Famicom game. Wardner's outdated-looking graphics just completely lacked the charm of the arcade's originals. If the gameplay had been improved, that would have made up for the game's ugliness. As it stands, the results are pretty disappointing. I'm not saying it's a bad game. Wardner's way better than all the terrible Kasugi platformers we've seen, but it certainly could have been a lot better. Our last game this episode, and one which has quite unexpectedly one of the most stylish introductions we've seen so far. Considering how the first two Vic Takai games were sorta lame, remember Chesterfield? It's a bit surprising that Golgo 13 starts off so confidently. We are virtually in Ninja Gaiden territory here. There is a rather convoluted plot, which is explained entirely in cutscenes and dialogue. It involves the CIA, the KGB, some mysterious criminal organization, and biological weapons. The US version is called Top Secret Episode. The original Japanese subtitle was more dramatic sounding Twilight of the Gods. A few changes have been made, namely the main bad guys in the Japanese version were Nazis. For the US release, they're simply a generic bunch of criminals in a syndicate or something like that. Now this game is based on the very famous and long-lived Golgo 13 series of manga, anime, and movies. Golgo 13, aka Duke Togo, is some sort of super assassin slash tough guy slash chick magnet slash anti-hero. The fact that he's a professional hitman is sort of glossed over in the US release of the game. As good as the production values on display here are, I wish the game itself were a bit better. The actual gameplay is much less impressive than all the window dressing. That's a complaint people have a lot about games today, but it was true back even in the 1980s. All the dialogue and cutscenes are connected together with a variety of action sequences, usually of the side-scrolling variety. They often just amount to walk several screens and enter a building. Unfortunately, the mechanics are quite janky. Just like in Predator, you can't duck and attack at the same time, meaning you generally have to jump over enemy bullets and then try to shoot them from behind. Though it is difficult to control your jumps, and I often find myself landing right on enemies, which is rather illogically damages you, but not them. Seriously, try this in real life and see who comes out for the worse, the guy who gets jumped on or the guy who does the jumping. Now, far more fun than these sequences are the ones that involve the first-person shooting. We have one here. These handle pretty well, and despite the fact that people are shooting at you, this is actually an opportunity to regain some health, since killing guys will sort of recharge your life bar. Now, Golgo 13 is one of those throw-in-everything but the kitchen sink games, and there is a surprising variety in the action sequences here. It's not all walking around and shooting people. Here, for example, we have a brief helicopter shoot-'em-up sequence. Though, since it's so easy to get hit, and the bad guys take a lot of bolts to destroy, it's a little frustrating. The first time I played this sequence, I actually ran out of bullets and was screwed. Now after this, we get perhaps the second most famous sequence in the game, one of several unique action set pieces. You need to perform an assassination using a sniper rifle from a helicopter. Now, how many games back in 1987 let you use sniper rifles? Which leads me to another point about Golgo 13. It contains a shocking amount of violence and sex for a Nintendo-approved game. As we see here, we are ready to... Ooh, look at that! Actual blood and guts in a Nintendo game, how strange. And what's that you said? Sex? Yes, this is probably the first Famicom game we've seen where you sort of unambiguously get laid in this sequence right here. If there's one thing this game is notorious for today, it's this part. How did this get past Nintendo censors? No idea. However, laying some pipe does cause your health meter to refill. So after this, you'll find yourself traveling to a wide variety of real-world locations, including an underwater scuba diving sequence, infiltrating a hidden base, and first-person mazes. While Golgo 13 should be highly commended for its excellent integration of story into the game and its huge variety of action sequences, not everything is as well done as it should be. For most folks, I'd say the deal breaker is probably the mazes. You will need to navigate several large and generic-looking mazes, full of trapdoors and fake walls. Really, the mazes pretty much kill any sense of fun in the game. One of the later mazes in particular is huge, and probably kept most gamers from actually finishing this thing. So I guess I'd say I'm sort of two minds when it comes to Golgo 13. It combines innovative concepts and presentation and gameplay with some rather knuckleheaded design decisions and awkward mechanics. There's a lot to admire, but I can't really say I love the game. In some ways, it's the most impressive game in this episode, but it's also a bit of a missed opportunity. It's a bit of a shame, but it definitely holds a unique place in the Nintendo library. We're not quite done with March yet. Next episode we'll finish it up, and we'll also have more military simulation games, and one game that is considered to be one of the worst NES games ever. Not to mention a classic beat-em-up and a weird game from Konami. So we'll be looking forward to that.